The sun was slipping behind the mesas when Eli Mercer turned off the highway. The desert stretched wide and empty, painted gold and rust, quiet enough that his own heartbeat felt too loud. He'd driven 6 hours from Phoenix with dust on his windshield and the taste of metal in his mouth. The road ended at an old cattle gate tied shut with wire. Beyond it, a dirt track led toward a single house, its roof sagging under years of silence. He checked the map, though he already knew this was the place. The locals called it the Begay Ranch, a place most people avoided after sundown. Eli stepped out of his truck. The air was dry enough to sting. Somewhere out in the distance, something howled once and then stopped. He was there to make a film about Navajo legends, disappearing livestock, strange shapes in the desert, things people whispered about but never named. He thought it was all stories until that first night on the mesa. Marcy Begay, the ranch owner, came out to meet him. She was thin and quiet, her eyes sharp as broken glass. She told him supper was ready, but her voice shook when the wind changed. "You shouldn't be here after dark," she said softly. "Things walk when the air turns hollow." Eli smiled, thinking she meant coyotes, but her eyes said something else, something afraid. After dinner, Eli set up his recorder on the porch to catch the sound of the wind through the canyons. It came low and steady, like a deep hum beneath the earth. Every few seconds, the sound dipped like a breath catching in my throat. When he played it back, he thought he heard words. Not clear ones, but faint murmurs, layered over the wind. He rewound it again and again until Marcy stepped outside and told him to stop. She said the wind carried voices that weren't meant to be heard. "Once it knows your name," she whispered, "it starts calling back." That night Eli couldn't sleep. He lay on the narrow bed by the window, listening to the desert breathing. Around midnight he heard footsteps outside, soft, dragging like something heavy being pulled. He sat up, heart hammering, but didn't move. The footsteps stopped right under the window. Then a voice called out. His own. "Eli," it said, low and careful, like someone testing the sound of it. He froze. The voice came again, clearer this time, whispering from the dark. Eli opens the door. He didn't. He waited, holding his breath, until the first light touched the sky. When he finally looked outside, there were no footprints in the sand, only a small pile of stones stacked neatly under the window, each one marked with a single black line. The morning came pale and quiet. Eli stepped outside, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The sky was clear, but the air felt heavy, like the world was waiting for something to happen. The smell hit him first, sweet and rotten, thick enough to taste. He followed it around the side of the house and stopped cold. A dead coyote hung from the fence, strung up by its front legs, its body stiff and stretched. Its eyes were still open, cloudy and full of flies. The fur on its chest had been cut away, showing ribs that glistened in the sunlight. Someone or something had carved shapes into the wood beneath it. Circles. Lines. I almost like writing. Eli felt sick, but his camera hand moved on its own. He lifted the lens and took the shot. The click of the shutter echoed too loud. Marcy came running when she saw what he'd found. She didn't scream. She just stood there, clutching a small pouch around her neck. "You shouldn't have touched it," she said, voice shaking. Eli told her he hadn't. He showed her the photo, but when she looked at it, she turned away and whispered a prayer under her breath. "That's not right," she muttered. "Coyotes don't hang themselves. And nothing human here would dare touch one." She went back inside and came out with sage, lighting it with trembling hands. The smoke rose in soft gray curls. She circled the fence 3 times, whispering words Eli didn't understand. When she was done, she turned to him with red eyes. "It knows you now," she said. Eli didn't ask what she meant. He wanted to, but something in her face stopped him. Instead, he packed his gear and drove out to film the mesa. The desert opened around him, endless and gold, but the feeling from the ranch clung to him. Every shadow looked too still. Every gust of wind sounded like breath. He filmed the horizon, trying to forget the coyotes' empty eyes. The footage came out strange. On playback, the wind roared louder than it should have, and at the edge of the frame, something moved. A shape, just at the limit of focus, tall and bent, walking the ridge like it was waiting for him to look. When he returned at dusk, Marcy was gone. Her truck was still there, keys in the ignition, but the house was dark. On the table lay a torn scrap of paper with a single line written in charcoal, "Don't listen if it calls your name." Eli sat there for a long time, staring at the words. The wind pushed against the walls, soft at first, then harder until the whole house seemed to breathe. Somewhere outside, something cried. Not a coyote, not a man, something in between. He closed his laptop, shut off the lights, and sat in the dark, camera in his lap. He told himself it was just wind, just fear. But when the voice came again, low and patient, saying his name from the other side of the door, he believed her. The desert felt colder the next morning. The sun rose dull and red, barely warming the sand. Eli searched the yard again, calling for Marcy, but the silence pressed down heavily, like the air itself didn't want to be disturbed. Her tracks led away from the porch, out past the dead coyote and into the open plain. They stopped halfway toward the ridge, swallowed by the dust. He waited by the truck, expecting her to come back, but by noon, the only sound was the wind brushing against the tin roof. He thought about leaving, driving back toward town, but the road felt wrong, like if he turned his back, it would vanish behind him. So he stayed. That afternoon, he drove to the nearby reservation to find Tom Yazzie, an old man Marcy said knew the stories. Tom's house sat low against the rocks, windows covered in blankets, yard lined with animal bones. He didn't invite Eli inside but spoke to him from the doorway. His voice was calm, steady, like someone long used to fear. Eli asked about the legends, about things that walked at night. Tom looked out at the mesa and said, "They're not legends. They're leftovers. Men who traded their faces to the dark and never got them back." Eli tried to ask more, but Tom raised a hand. "You already let it know you," he said quietly. "Now it'll come wearing what it took." Eli drove back as the sky turned purple. The ranch looked smaller somehow, swallowed by the desert. He set up his equipment again, needing to distract himself. He replayed the audio from his first night, turning the volume higher. Beneath the wind, the voices were clearer now. He could hear his name, stretched and soft, drawn out until it no longer sounded like him. He stopped the playback, then froze. The voice kept going. From outside. From right under the window. He crept to the curtain, heart pounding so hard he thought it might give him away. A shadow passed across the sand, slow and tall. Then the voice came again, gentle this time, almost kind. "Eli," it said. "You left the light on." His hand shook as he reached for the switch. The bulb flickered once, then went out, leaving the room swallowed in darkness. Through the thin glass, he could see only the outline of something standing perfectly still with long arms, wrong shape. It didn't move, but the whispering never stopped. Eli sat on the floor until dawn, back against the wall, eyes fixed on that window. When the sun finally rose, he dared to look. There was nothing outside. Just sand, wind, and the faint outline of bare footprints circling the house on its own. By the third day, Eli's nerves were raw. Every sound made him flinch, the rustle of the wind, the dry whisper of sand against glass. Marcy's truck still sat outside, half buried in dust. Her coffee mug remained on the table, cold and untouched. Eli tried calling for help, but his phone had no signal. The world around him felt cut off, sealed behind invisible walls of air and silence. He thought maybe he was losing it. To clear his head, he took his drone out to film the landscape. The desert stretched endless, colorless, almost unreal. From above, it looked like a sleeping animal, quiet, waiting. Then on the drone screen, something strange appeared. A perfect black circle marked the sand less than a mile from the ranch. The edges were clean and burned, as if the ground itself had caught fire and gone cold again. Eli turned the drone toward it, moving lower. No footprints led in or out. Just that circle wide enough for a man to stand in, dark enough to swallow the sun's reflection. As the drone hovered, the wind rose, static filled his headset, and a whisper slipped through. Not wind this time, his name, drawn long and quiet. Eli 3, the video feed flickered. For 1 second before the screen cut to static, he saw something. A figure at the circle's edge, tall, thin, watching the drone. He drove out there before he could think better of it. The burned circle was real. The sand inside it was black and glassy, melted into strange shapes. The air smelled faintly of iron, like blood and rain. Eli crouched down, brushing his hand over the edge, and his fingers came back streaked with ash. The ground was warm. When he looked up, he thought he saw movement on the ridge, something crawling low, too fast to be human. He turned his camera that way, but the lens fogged instantly. Then came the wind, rushing down from nowhere, so strong it nearly knocked him over. It carried whispers again, not one voice but many, blending together until they made words. Mercer. He stumbled back to the truck, heart hammering, trying not to look over his shoulder. Every instinct screamed at him to leave. But as he drove, something crossed the road ahead. Not an animal, not exactly. It was shaped like a man, but too long, too jointed, its head turning too slowly. It didn't walk, it folded across the road, vanishing behind a rise. When Eli reached the spot, there was nothing there. Only the smell of burned sage and the faint outline of a handprint pressed into the dust. That night, he locked every door, every window. He sat on the floor with his back to the wall, the camera clutched tight. The footage replayed on his laptop, frozen on the static. He swore he could still hear the whisper under the noise, repeating his name until it didn't sound like a name anymore. When the wind shifted, the lights flickered once. He felt the air change heavily, like something breathing against the glass. Then from outside, a voice said softly, "You found it." The next morning, the sky was a dull white, like bone. Eli packed what he could into his truck. He couldn't stay at the ranch anymore. Every board and nail felt haunted. He told himself he was leaving for good, but when he reached the dirt road, he stopped. On the horizon, past the ridge, stood the crumbling outline of an old Spanish mission. Marcy had mentioned it once, saying no one went there anymore, not since the fire years ago. Eli didn't know why, but he turned the wheel toward it. Maybe he thought he'd find her there. Maybe he just wanted answers. The wind followed him all the way, whispering across the sand. The mission sat half buried in dust, its bell tower leaning to one side, its doors chained shut. Inside, the air was thick with soot and something sweet, like old fruit left to rot. Eli pushed open a window and climbed through. Sunlight spilled across the floor, catching the broken glass and black scorch marks on the walls. The altar was still there, stone cracked and gray. Carved into it were symbols, circles and jagged lines, the same shapes burned into the fence back at the ranch. Beneath them, in darker grooves, were other marks, older ones, cut deep like someone had tried to hide them. He brushed the dust away. Underneath, he saw faces, human, distorted, mouths open as if in mid-scream. Eli heard something move then. A soft shuffle like bare feet dragging on stone. He turned slowly, camera ready. "Marcy?" he called, his voice too small in the vast silence. No answer. Only the wind moaning through the bell tower. He stepped toward the confessional booth in the corner, its door slightly ajar. A trail of sand led to it, but not away. "Hello?" he said again. When he pulled the door open, the smell of copper filled his nose. The booth was empty except for his own camera bag resting neatly on the bench. He stared at it in disbelief. It was the same bag he'd left back at the ranch, still covered in dust and blood-speckled sand. He backed away, heart pounding, until his shoulder hit the altar. The air grew thick, the light dimming even though the sun still burned outside. The wind rose, spinning through the ruins, and for a heartbeat it sounded like laughter of its own, twisted and faint. Eli bolted for the window, tripping over a broken pew. When he looked back, he saw movement in the dark corner of the booth. Something stood there now, half hidden, its shape wrong, too tall to fit under the roof. Its head turned, slow and deliberate. He didn't wait to see more. Outside, the desert seemed to breathe. The wind pushed against him as if trying to keep him from leaving. He climbed into his truck and drove until the mission disappeared behind him. But the feeling stayed. The air in his lungs felt stolen, borrowed. And when he looked in the rearview mirror just for a second, he thought he saw something sitting in the back seat, all still, smiling in a face that wasn't his. By dusk, the wind had turned cold. Eli drove until the desert bled into the hills, until his eyes blurred from dust and exhaustion. He found himself back near the ranch without meaning to, the road curling him home like a hand closing around his throat. The lights from the house flickered weakly through the dusk. He almost didn't stop, but the thought of Marcy wouldn't leave him. Maybe she had come back. Maybe she was alive. He parked and stepped out. The air was thick with the smell of burned sage and something underneath it sweet and wet. The front door creaked open when he touched it. Marcy stood by the table, her back to him, hair tangled and dark. "Marcy?" he said softly. She turned slowly, and for a second relief hit him so hard he nearly cried. But then she smiled. It wasn't right. Her face looked stretched too tight, like the skin didn't quite belong to her. Her eyes didn't blink. "You shouldn't have gone there," she said, voice soft and echoing as if spoken from far away. Eli stepped back. "What happened to you?" he whispered. Marcy tilted her head and her neck cracked. "It found you," she said. "Now it's learning." Eli grabbed his camera and stepped toward the light. Marcy moved closer too, each step jerky like she was remembering how to walk. Her shadow lagged behind her, bending the wrong way. "You saw it," she whispered, her voice starting to split into two tones, one human, one low and rough. "It wears what it takes. It learns the shape. You gave it your name." Eli's breath came fast. "Where is it?" he asked. Marcy smiled wider. "Here," she said, and then her skin rippled, shifting as though something underneath was pushing to get out. The air smelled like rot and dust. Eli stumbled back, knocking over a chair. When he blinked, Marcy was gone. The door swung open, slamming against the wall. The wind howled through the house, whispering his name in a dozen voices at once. He ran outside, scanning the horizon, but the desert was empty. The only sound was the whispering wind. Then, behind him, the screen door creaked. He turned and saw himself standing in the doorway. His own face, his own eyes. But the smile was wrong. It was too calm, too knowing. The figure raised a hand, and Eli's stomach dropped as it spoke in his exact voice, slow and quiet. "You should have left when it called." He ran. Into the night, into the dark hum of the desert, until the ranch disappeared behind him. The wind followed, carrying his own name like a prayer that had turned into a curse. The desert storm came at night. The wind rose first, a low hum across the sand that grew until it screamed through the gaps in the truck's windows. Eli had parked on a ridge miles from the ranch. He thought distance would help, that the thing wouldn't follow him so far. Now the air itself seemed alive, pressing in from all sides. The dust turned the headlights into a dull glow, the sky a swirling wall of grit. He kept the engine off and listened. Beneath the storm's roar were other sounds, faint, stretched voices crying out in words he almost knew. He shut his eyes, whispering to himself that it was only the wind. But the wind whispered back. He tried to record it, thinking maybe proof would make it real, make it explainable. The microphone hissed, catching bursts of breath, a whisper of laughter. The more he listened, the clearer the voices became. They weren't strangers. They were the missing people Marcy had mentioned. The ranchers, the children, the names carved into the post office wall. He could hear them calling for help, calling his name, begging for light. Eli's hands shook as he turned the volume down, but the sound didn't stop. It filled the truck, curling around him like smoke. "Let us in," they said over and over. Then lower, a single new voice joined them on his own. Panic drove him out into the storm. The sand hit his face like knives. He stumbled through it, trying to see, but the air was too thick to breathe. Flashes of light split the sky, showing shapes that shouldn't have been there. A figure moved across the ridge, long-limbed, crouched, crawling faster than anything should crawl. It was coming toward him, even against the wind. He turned and ran downhill, his boots sinking in the soft sand, every breath raw. Somewhere behind him, something laughed, high and thin, a sound that didn't belong in his throat. He fell near a dry wash, pulling himself beneath a ledge as the wind screamed above. The voices swirled around him, a storm inside the storm. He pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound was already under his skin and his heartbeat. He thought of Marcy's warning, things walk when the air turns hollow. Now he understood. The storm wasn't weather, it was breathing. The desert was alive and it was hungry. He stayed there until dawn, shaking, covered in dust. When the wind finally died, he crawled out. The world was still. The sand was smooth, untouched. Only one thing remained of the storm. His own footprints circling the spot where he had hidden, as if he had walked around himself all night long. By morning the air felt wrong again, still, heavy, too quiet for the open desert. Eli hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his own face grinning from the dark. The storm had buried his truck halfway in sand. He dug it free, but when he started the engine, it coughed once and died. He was trapped miles from the nearest road. The silence pressed down like a hand on his throat. He checked his recorder, hoping to erase the voices. Instead, a new file blinked on the screen, time-stamped while he slept. He pressed play. Footsteps. Breathing. Then his own voice whispered, "Follow the wind." The air shifted, pulling softly toward the west. He didn't want to obey it, but something in his chest moved before his thoughts could stop it. He walked. The desert stretched endless and pale, the sun glaring like an eye. Hours passed until the sand broke into rock and the wind began to hum again, low and steady. Ahead lay a narrow canyon, barely wide enough for a man to slip through. The walls were etched with strange symbols, some burned, some carved. The air smelled like iron and rot. At the canyon's end waited for a clearing, shadowed by cliffs. In the center, surrounded by animal bones and black stones, was a pit. Eli stepped closer. The pit was shallow, lined with something that glistened under the light skin. Human skin stretched tight over the walls, stitched with coarse thread. He staggered back, bow rising in his throat. The wind whistled through the bones, and for a moment he thought it was singing. He raised his camera with trembling hands, needing to capture it to prove he wasn't mad. The lens focused on a shape beside the pit, an arm or what was left of one, the hand twisted into a fist around a charm made of coyote teeth. Beneath it, the sand shifted. He wasn't alone. Something crawled out of the shadows, dragging itself with broken limbs. It was the old man from Gallup, the one who'd warned him to leave. But now his skin hung loose, his eyes black and hollow. His mouth split into a grin too wide for his face. "It knows you," he rasped, voice cracked and doubled. "It wears you now." Eli stepped back, but the man crawled faster, bones cracking with each movement. His voice dropped lower, almost gentle. "You called it when you listened. You let it in." Eli turned and ran. The wind rose behind him, howling through the canyon, carrying his name in every gust. When he reached the open desert again, the sun was gone, the horizon bleeding red. He didn't stop running until he collapsed beside the truck. His lungs burned and his hands were shaking. The recorder was still on, the light blinking steady. The wind hissed through it, whispering words he couldn't understand. Then, faint and clear, came the sound of laughter of his own. Night fell fast. The desert swallowed the last of the light, leaving only the cold and the whisper of the wind moving across the sand. Eli sat beside the dead truck, shivering. The recorder kept blinking. He wanted to smash it, but he couldn't move. He felt watched. Every sound, every sigh of the wind, every grain of sand sliding underfoot seemed to carry a heartbeat that wasn't his. When he finally stood, his shadow rose a second later, moving just slightly out of rhythm. He froze. Slowly, the shadow turned its head toward him. He backed away, eyes fixed on the ground. The shadow didn't follow, but something else did. The air shimmered. The shape of a man appeared, tall and bent, its edges rippling like heat over asphalt. It had Eli's outline but hollowed, thinner, the skin too tight, the eyes too wide. It stood where the wind blew hardest, and with each gust, its face seemed to shift, cycling through expressions of his own fear, his mother's voice, Marcy's smile, then back again. Eli wanted to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. "Why me?" he whispered. The thing tilted its head, the motion soft, curious. Then with his own voice it answered, "Because you listen." He turned and ran into the dark, the sand slipping beneath his boots. The thing followed without footsteps. It didn't chase, it simply appeared closer each time he looked back, as though the space between them wasn't real. The stars seemed to dim when it drew near. His breath came in sharp gasps. His flashlight flickered and died, leaving only moonlight and the whispering hum that grew louder with every step. Then ahead he saw a campfire burning low beside a cluster of stones. He ran toward it, desperate, the thing's shape blurring in the corner of his eye. An old woman sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket of dark wool. Her hair was silver, her eyes still and deep. She didn't look surprised to see him. "You've brought it too close," she said. Her voice carried the weight of the land. Eli collapsed near the fire, shaking. "What is it?" he managed to ask. The woman didn't look at him. "Not what?" she said softly. "Oh, once it was a man. A singer. He broke the old law, wore another's shape. Now it wears any who calls its name." Her gaze lifted toward the darkness where the wind gathered. "You should never speak to the hollow wind." The fire flickered. Something stood just beyond the circle of light, motionless. Eli felt his throat tighten. "How do I stop it?" he whispered. The woman looked at him finally, her eyes full of sorrow. "You don't. You only return what it took." She handed him a small clay jar tied with a strip of hide. "Give it your voice. All of it. Then leave this place before dawn." Eli held the jar, cold and heavy. The thing stepped closer, the air bending around it. He unscrewed the lid. The wind rushed in. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the fire went out. The desert before dawn was colder than he had ever known. The stars felt closer, sharp and endless. Eli stood on the ridge, the clay jar clutched tight in his hands. The old woman was gone, only her footprints remained, leading nowhere. The air was still, holding its breath. He didn't know if what he was about to do would save him or finish what had already begun. All he knew was that the thing waited somewhere behind him. He could feel its gaze on the back of his neck like heat. He turned slowly. It stood among the rocks, pale in the moonlight, wearing his face. The thing smiled and the wind stirred. "You gave me your sound," it said in his voice. "Now give me your silence." Eli felt tears burn his eyes. "Take it," he whispered. "Just leave me." He pulled the lid from the jar. The air rushed inward with a force that made his ears pop. The wind around them froze. Every sound pulled toward the jar until even the earth seemed to hold still. The thing's face twisted, skin rippling like it was being peeled away. It reached for him, its hands stretching longer than they should, but the pull was stronger. The wind tore through both of them, roaring, hollow, endless. When it stopped, Eli was on his knees. The jar lay cracked beside him, empty. The thing was gone, or maybe it had never been separate from him at all. The desert was still again. The horizon began to glow faintly with morning light. He tried to breathe, but the air felt strange, thick with quiet. He opened his mouth to call out, but no sound came. His voice was gone. Completely. He touched his throat, panic rising, then lowered his hands slowly. The wind brushed past his face once, almost gentle, like a hand saying goodbye. He walked for hours until the sun climbed high and the world turned gold again. The silence followed him, heavy but peaceful. When he reached the main road, he saw a pickup truck coming. He waved, but no voice rose from his mouth. The driver stopped, an old rancher with sunburned skin and tired eyes. "You okay, son?" he asked. Eli tried to answer. Nothing. The man frowned, then nodded toward the back seat. "Climb in. The town's just an hour east." Eli looked once more toward the desert. The sand shimmered, whispering with each gust. Then he climbed in. As the truck drove away, the wind rose behind them, soft but clear. It carried a voice now faint, echoing, familiar. It wasn't his, but it used his name.